My lords, have you ever asked how big the individual ships are in Stellaris? Is a corvette 100 meters or several thousand? How many people would it take to crew a Titan? Well, today I'm going to attempt to answer those questions, and I've enlisted the help of the community to do just that. So thank you to everyone who participated. I'll stress it was an awful lot of fun to dig into this, but do remember it's entirely speculation. Your thoughts on it may be wildly different to mine and everyone else's. Nevertheless, due to the classified nature of our space program, naval battleship specifications are hard to acquire, and so I'll use several different methods to ascertain the precise size of each warship. And I should stress, I'm focused on mammalian, human ships here. The three methods that I'm going to use for this are crew sizes, which also have community estimates in them, scaling up from a strike craft, and window counting. I'll start with the crew theory. Using the help of the community, over the course of several weeks, I attempted to establish just how large the crew sizes of various vessels are. The rules were fairly straightforward. I set up a poll for each of the different ships with a crew size range and asked the community to vote on what they thought was the most likely. Most of the polls ended up with over 50% of the vote choosing one specific answer, and that's the answer that we'll move forward with, though some were admittedly closer. I also stressed that the crew of these ships were human, but I didn't give guidance on levels of automation, for example. Bearing that in mind, let's start with the Corvette. At just under 6,000 votes, the top choice with 43% of the vote for the Corvette was 25 to 74 human crew. 75 to 150 received 21% of the vote, 0 to 24 was 20%, and greater than 150 was 16%. So this was by no means a landslide, but nevertheless it gave me a solid basis to work with. And ironically, this one was actually one of the two least agreed upon of all of the crew sizes of the ships in the fleet. Now admittedly, this was the first one, and there were so many variables to consider when using crew size as a proxy for ship size, i.e. how many of the crew can fit on the ship comfortably. Do the crew share bunks, or do they all get individual quarters? How much of the ship is automated, as this would realistically take a large burden away from the crew? How much space do the engines take up? How much space do the weapons array take up? These are questions I can't really answer, but we can at least be consistent across the entire naval fleet. Therefore, we are assuming a fair level of automation and some level of bunk room sharing, perhaps between the watches. I would assume that the officers at least have their own rooms, and the larger ships will have extra facilities aboard beyond pure military, i.e. the crew of a battleship may be several thousand men and women, and they will need to be looked after somewhat. There's going to need to be some recreation facilities. But back to the original question. How big is a corvette, assuming a crew of approximately 50 people, the midway point between 25 and 74? I'm going to suggest a corvette is approximately 100 to 150 meters in length. 50 crew gives us 3 watches of 17 crew apiece, so 33 will be off at any one time. So as an average, this would give us a vessel approximately 125 meters long, 20 meters wide and 20 meters high. This gives us a value of approximately 1,000 meters cubed per person, which, say compared to a modern day nuclear submarine, is about 13 times more space per person. This increased space will clearly be taken up by things such as FTL drives, advanced monitoring equipment, and likely some large laser and kinetic weapon arrays. However, these dimensions, 125 by 20 by 20, I feel are very reasonable for an FTL capable corvette that is capable of operating isolated for several years if required. For further context, a ship this size would be similar in scale to the Serenity from Firefly, or the Normandy SR-1 from Mass Effect, or from Star Wars, the Corellian Corvette, the CR-90. Of course, this calculation and the corvette size sets up a precedent for all the future sizes, so if you wildly disagree with the size of a corvette, well, you're probably going to disagree with the rest of the ships as well. Moving on to destroyers. You, the people, voted that destroyers' crew size was within the range of 150 to 299 humans, with 60% of the vote, 16% of you thought it was more likely to be 50 to 149, 14% of you thought it would be 300 to 499, and only 9% of you thought it was over 500. Since we've established a rough volume per person, we'll use that calculation to scale up to the size of a destroyer, but we won't just increase the length, we'll get wider and higher as well. That calculation comes out to approximately 206 meters in length with a height and width of approximately 33 meters, which again doesn't feel unreasonable at all for a destroyer class vessel. This would be comparable to the USS Defiant from Star Trek, but slightly larger, with the caveat that our destroyers probably need larger crews to account for the lack of automation versus the Star Trek universe. This destroyer would also be slightly smaller than a Nebulon B frigate from Star Wars, but roughly double the length doesn't feel unreasonable for a destroyer given the extra weapons array that it may need. Moving on to cruisers, and of course we're going to start to get to bigger, bulkier ships. 54% of you voted that cruisers have crew complements of approximately 501 to 99, so we're averaging 750 people per ship. 31% of you thought they were much larger, with crews of 1,000 to 3,000. 8% thought they were less than 500, and only 6% thought they were larger than 3,000. So using the same metrics as before, this gives us a ship of 309 meters by 50 by 50. For context and comparison, this would be similar in size to a colonial Battlestar Valkyrie class warship, the UNN Truman class dreadnought from The Expanse, or a Munificent class star frigate from Star Wars, or perhaps the Miranda class, the USS Reliant from Star Trek. I'm hoping you're with me so far. Moving on to battleships now, and we're going to get quite large indeed. 56% of you voted that battleships have crews of approximately 2,500 to 5,000. 21% of you thought it was more, in the region of 5,000 to 10,000, 11% of you thought it was even higher than 10,000, and 12% of you thought it was less than 2,500. So, if we assume an approx crew size of 3,750, 3,750, the numbers we get are a length of 529 meters and a height width of 85 meters. And this is putting us now in the range of some really bulky contenders. We're larger than anything in the Expanse galaxy, similar in size to a Paris-class frigate from Halo or the Excelsior class vessel from Star Trek. But we've still got Titans, Juggernauts and Colossi to go. 55% of you voted that a Titan crew size is going to be between 15 to 25,000, and because of that, the numbers are really starting to scale up. Using the same methods as before, we end up with a starship approximately 921 meters in length with a width height of 147 meters. Therefore, this Titan-class warship would be larger than the USS Enterprise D and could just about take a Venator-class Star Destroyer. A Marathon-class cruiser would be the closest ship to this from the Halo universe. Which leads us to the largest ship in Stellaris, the Juggernaut. With almost 6,000 votes, 54% of you voted a Juggernaut crew size to be between 100,000 and 500,000. They are literally floating cities. Thus, this ship would come out at approximately 2,275 meters by 364 by 364. This would weigh in at approximately 235 million metric tons. So we finally got something that can dwarf an Imperial Star Destroyer. The Juggernaut would be larger than the Battlestar Galactica, the Pegasus, a CCS-class battlecruiser, and both a Class 1 and Class 2 Imperial Star Destroyer. I'll touch on the Colossus, but I won't use the crew to estimate its size, as we via the community discussion established that it's basically a giant power station with a large gun. Thus, although the community eventually settled on a crew between 25 to 50,000, the actual size of the vessel is unlikely to reflect its crew complement. Nevertheless, this was certainly a fun way to try and nail down the ship sizes by using crew complement, and hopefully this gives you an insight on whether or not your thoughts on crew line up with that of the general community. The second method is scaling. Scaling up is conceptually the simplest way to estimate ship sizes. So, let's start here. This means we have to assign a value to the smallest ship available to us, the strike craft, and clearly this is somewhat open to interpretation. We know that a strike craft is a single-seater fighter, based on the Apocalypse trailer. This would be akin to an X-Wing, a Viper, or a Sabre. We can see them in action against the Gamma aliens when the UNE suffered a great defeat, losing its Europa colony. Nose to tail, the three ships I just mentioned are: a Viper is 8.4 meters, an X-Wing is 12.5, and a Sabre is 24.9. For further context, a modern day F-22 is 19 meters and an F-35 is 16 meters. Therefore, it doesn't feel unreasonable to place our single-seater strike craft anywhere from 15 to 20 meters in length. Remember, if you wildly disagree at this point, maybe you'd prefer the crew method we've just discussed, or the window method coming on shortly. By assigning the strike craft a length of approximately 20 meters, we have a figure to work off and attempt to scale up from this. And I've done this by drawing a line and then counting the pixels in the line. Using this lovely screenshot and these red lines, we can scale up the pixels of the strike craft and apply it to all the other ships. This means that our corvette would be 171 meters in length, the destroyer is slightly larger at 201, the cruiser jumps up to 327, the battleship weighs in at 411, and the Titan hits 782. It's almost twice as large as the battleship. Clearly the Peridician beam takes up a lot of room. The Juggernaut actually appears to measure slightly shorter than the Titan, with a wingspan of only 622 meters, but in fairness it's also much thicker and potentially much taller. The Colossus hits 533 meters, and finally the Star Eater, which I threw in because why not, has a length of 420 meters, but since it's a cube, it's rather large indeed, having an internal volume of 74 million meters cubed. And if we built it of tungsten, because why not, it would weigh a casual 1.43 billion tons. Quite cool. But in reality, it's actually quite small compared with moons and planets. For context, this wouldn't even come close to being 0.1% of the moon's weight, but it's a fun experiment. Circling back to the Juggernaut, clearly there was an issue here with the measurement, and I think it was due to the orientation of the line that I drew. Therefore, I've switched the image and drawn a new line. I've then used the Titan as the baseline. This gives us a new measurement for the Juggernaut of 1260 meters, which feels far more reasonable compared to the other vessels, and I apologise for that mistake. So it seems at this stage that scaling up from a strike craft, our ships appear much smaller than we anticipated regarding crew sizes. I think this is largely because strike craft, although very small, are scaled in game to a somewhat visible size, whereas in reality they would be significantly smaller than the larger ships. But I also suspect that a Colossus could be much larger than what's displayed, but I guess they need to cap ship size somewhere. Moving on to the next and final method, the window method. Now this is remarkably straightforward. We count the windows of the ship and try to figure out its length and size from there. This is of course quite awkward, as not all the ships have clear and obvious windows, and not all of the ships have windows running in a nice length from bow to stern. Nevertheless, we must pick a size for the window, and I'm going to go with a nice round 1 meter by 1 meter square cabin window. 1 meter doesn't feel unreasonable to me at all, it doesn't feel too large, maybe they would be a little bit smaller, but it's a nice round number to work off. So, we're going to take the central band of a Titan class vessel, as this is one of the best in terms of completeness for windows. If we count all of the individual windows on the central band, we get approximately 900, give or take. Given that the lights don't necessarily account for every meter of the central band of the Titan, but they are frequent, I'd suggest it has around an 80% coverage. Therefore, this gives us approximately 900 meters of window, which would mean a total ship length of 1.1 kilometers, which actually feels really reasonable compared to the other two processes that we've already looked at. If we bring the three methods together, this puts a mammalian class Titan warship in the range of 782 meters to 1,100 meters. And you know what? I'm quite happy with that. Despite the three fairly wildly different methods to do this, we've ended up with a range that isn't miles away from one another. Clearly, this isn't perfect, and ship scaling in game is somewhat arbitrary, since we have to be able to see the ships to play the game. Certainly when you compare the ship sizes to planets, well, yeah. Clearly this was some speculation, and please remember it's ultimately just a bit of fun. If you headcanon your Titans to be 10 kilometers long, with the crew in the several millions, that's absolutely fine by me, but I did have fun doing this. If you were entertained and are interested in seeing how this compares to the various space fauna, biological ships, maybe even the behemoth, then let me know and I'll consider doing it. And if you got this far, please consider subscribing.